Good morning. We had a few people here just coming in the back, and welcome to everyone here. Just a reminder, this quarter we're talking about David and Solomon. So we have completed David's. We talked about Solomon's wisdom last week and had some great comments from people, and appreciate everyone's participation last week on Solomon's wisdom. Today we're going to look at Solomon's temple. I found myself bogged down in so much information this week. It was fascinating. It was unbelievable, the extent of the work that went into his temple. But it was just mound after mound of information. So forgive me if I repeat myself this morning, because I'm going to be reading some things from dictionary, and some things may overlap just because there was such a wealth of information about this particular chapter on Solomon building the temple. We're going to, in our text, be in 2 Chronicles chapter 2. So if you want to be turning there, 2 Chronicles chapter 2. But there's also a parallel passages in 1 Kings. So also 1 Kings chapter 6 and 7 go along with this 2 Chronicles passage, but I'm going to be working primarily out of 2 Chronicles chapter 2. After David became king and he defeated all of the foes of Israel, God gave him rest from his enemies all around, the Bible says in 2 Samuel chapter 7. He no longer had to focus exclusively on defending the nation. You know, he had defended it successfully. He started thinking about building a temple to glorify God. And he revealed this to the prophet Nathan. And David said, "See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells inside tent curtains." Although Nathan initially responded to David's idea favorably in a positive way, the Lord came back and instructed the prophet, "Go back to David with a different message." So Nathan was told to go back and remind David that God had never asked, "Why have you not built me a house of cedar?" So this was not something initially the Lord had asked for. Nathan was also to assure David that God would eventually appoint a place for my people Israel. But most importantly, Nathan was to tell David that God would make you a house. So God was going to be the builder of this house. He was building this house for David. In other words, God intended to establish David's royal line going forward. So he, rather than David, would be the one building going forward. But the Lord would build David's house into a dynasty. And we're just starting to see in this passing on to Solomon what the Lord worked in. But ultimately, David would not construct the temple, but one of his sons, Solomon, would. Revealing this plan, Nathan then relayed God's word to David. And he said, "When your days are fulfilled and you rest with your fathers, I will set up your seed after you, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." So late in his reign, David began to make these preparations for the temple that ultimately Solomon would build. He did this by gathering workers from all over. He gathered the workers from, we see in 1 Chronicles chapter 22, he appointed masons to cut heavy stones to build the house of God. Additionally, David prepared iron in abundance for the nails of the doors and the gates and for the joints, and bronze in abundance beyond measure, and cedar trees in abundance. So, explaining why he had done this, David said, "Well, Solomon, my son, is young and inexperienced, And the house to be built for the Lord must be exceedingly magnificent, famous and glorious throughout all countries. I will now make preparations for it." So David made all these abundant preparations in advance before he died, helping gather all these materials that ultimately would go into the temple. So he made it possible for Solomon to ultimately build the temple with the start on these materials. So Solomon became Israel's king. He understood this task that was before him. For David had previously charged Solomon and told Solomon, "Now my son, may the Lord be with you, and may you prosper and build the house of the Lord your God, as he has said to you. Only may the Lord give you wisdom and understanding, and give you charge concerning Israel, that you may keep the law of the Lord your God." So that was in 1 Chronicles chapter 22. So some supplies were gathered in preparation. Some help was available as they gathered helpers. And the assignment was clear that Solomon was to build the temple, and he was going to do so. In part of the preparation for the temple, well, we'll get there in a minute. So let's read 2 Chronicles chapter 2. We're just going to go on and read that whole chapter and then come back and look at it and then add some background to it as well. 2 Chronicles chapter 2. Now Solomon purposed to build a temple for the name of the Lord, and a royal palace for himself. And Solomon assigned 70,000 men to bear burdens, and 80,000 to quarry in the hill country, and 3,600 to oversee them. And Solomon sent word to Hiram, the king of Tyre, "As you dealt with David my father, and sent him cedar to build himself a house to dwell in, so deal with me. Behold, I am about to build a house for the name of the Lord my God, and dedicate it to him for the burning of incense, of sweet spices before him, and for the regular arrangement of the showbread, and for burnt offerings morning and evening, on the Sabbaths and the new moons and the appointed feasts of the Lord our God, as ordained forever in Israel. The house that I'm to build will be great, for our God is greater than all gods. But who is able to build him a house, since heaven, even highest heaven, cannot contain him? Who am I to build a house for him, except as a place to make offerings before him? So now send me a man skilled to work in gold, silver, bronze, and iron, and in purple, crimson, and blue fabrics, trained also in engraving, to be with the skilled workers who are with me in Judah and Jerusalem, whom David my father provided. Send me also cedar, cypress, and algum timber from Lebanon, for I know that your servants know how to cut timber in Lebanon, and my servants will be with your servants to prepare timber for me in abundance, for the house I am to build will be great and wonderful. I will give for your servants, the woodsmen who cut timber, 20,000 cores of crushed wheat, 20,000 cores of barley, 20,000 baths of wine, and 20,000 baths of oil." Then Hiram the king of Tyre answered in a letter that he sent to Solomon, "Because the Lord loves his people, he has made you king over them." Hiram also said, "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, who made heaven and earth, who has given King David a wise son, who has discretion and understanding, who will build a temple for the Lord and a royal palace for himself. Now I have sent a skilled man who has understanding, Huram-Abi, the son of a woman of the daughters of Dan, and his father was a man of Tyre. He is trained to work in gold, silver, bronze, iron, stone, and wood, and in purple, blue, and crimson fabrics, and fine linen, and to do all sorts of engraving and execute any design that may be assigned him with your craftsmen, the craftsmen of my lord David your father. Now therefore the wheat and barley, oil and wine, of which my Lord has spoken, let him send to his servants. And we will cut whatever timber you need from Lebanon and bring it to you in rafts by sea to Joppa, so that you may take it up to Jerusalem. Then Solomon counted all the resident aliens who were in the land of Israel after the census of them that David his father had taken, and there were found 153,600. 70,000 of them he assigned to bear burdens, 80,000 to quarry in the hill country, and 3,600 as overseers to make the people work. So after reading through this entire chapter, we're going to look here at the temple and some of these builders that are going to be provided. But before we do, when we look at David's preparations, and we see, I'm sorry, this is kind of small, the location for the place where the temple is to be built. It was to be built on Mount Moriah. Now, Mount Moriah was the location where Abraham was tested with the sacrifice of Isaac before God. And on top of Mount Moriah was a large rock outcropping, and that is what the temple is built on. This is just a short ways out of Jerusalem, and in fact, the Jerusalem itself eventually extends out and encompasses this whole area. So right now, though, in this Mount Moriah area, this is going to be the place where the temple is located, and Solomon's palace is going to be located. So these new building projects that Solomon is about to undertake. Now, this is just somebody's rendition of what it might have looked like. But anyway, just so you know, it was raised. It was a mountain area. It was between valleys, so it was a prominent mount, and there's lots of history there in the Old Testament with Abraham and Isaac, and then David had acquired this area. And you also might hear the threshing floor of Araunah. This was the area that David had previously acquired. And this is the area that the temple was going to be built on, as well as Solomon's palace in that area. So we see in verse 5 that the temple that Solomon intended to build was going to be great. He wanted to bring the greatest honor to God by building this temple. And given the size and the grandeur of this project, Solomon had to secure even more workers and more supplies than David actually had started gathering. So although this is going to take both time and effort, Solomon was really up for the task. He was wise. He knew how to gather these things and make it happen. So he was really determined to build this temple for the name of the Lord. The word in New King James, determined, is also translated decided or maybe purposed. So we see in verse 1, this was something he was really determined to do. He had a focus on it, and this was going to be his project to build the temple for the Lord. This is the very thing that the law of Moses demanded of God's people. For Moses wrote in Deuteronomy 12:5, "But you shall seek the place where the Lord your God chooses out of all your tribes to put his name for his dwelling place, and there you shall go." So there are thousands of laborers needed to build this project, and they were selected by Solomon. Some translations say conscripted. But Solomon understood that stone had to be cut and carried so that the temple could be constructed. He also understood the need to have individuals oversee the project. A large number of these workers were not Israelites. To determine how much laborers were available, Solomon did number the aliens in the area who were in the land after the census that David, his father, had numbered them. and there were 153,600 in the land of Israel. And as we had read, he made 70,000 bearers of burdens, 80,000 stone cutters in the mountain, and 3,600 overseers to make the people work. To secure these additional needs of materials, Solomon reached out and sent a letter to Hiram, who was the king of Tyre. And he began acknowledging to Hiram the relationship that Hiram had had with his father David. And Solomon said, "As you have dealt with David my father and sent him cedars to build himself a house to dwell in, so deal with me." And then there's a verse in 1 Kings chapter 5, in the first verse there, it said, Hiram had always loved David. So whatever that relationship was, they had a close relationship, David and Hiram. So we find Hiram was more than happy to assist Solomon in this undertaking. And Solomon needed two things he's asking for here of Hiram. First, he needed additional help. Making this known, Solomon's letter to Hiram said, "Therefore, send me at once a man skillful to work in gold and silver, in bronze and iron, in purple and crimson and blue, who has skill to engrave with the skillful men who are with me in Judah and Jerusalem, whom David my father provided." This request reminds us that the temple itself is more than just a structure. This is going to be a beautiful piece of art that they are building to glorify God. Secondly, Solomon needed timber. And although Israel had an abundance of stone, if we think about the landscape, Israel did not have vast quantities of timber. So he needed some timber from Hiram, and the king promised to pay Hiram sufficiently for his trouble. So after receiving this request from Solomon, Hiram responded. He began his letter of response complimenting Solomon, and he wrote, "Because the Lord loves his people, he has made you king over them." And he added, "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, who made heaven and earth, for he has given King David a wise son, endowed with prudence and understanding, who will build a temple for the Lord and a royal house for himself." So it's possible that Hiram's response, it may have been political, but it also could be very possible that he was a believer in Yahweh, in the Lord. And it could have been coming from his relationship with David in the past. But whether he had this belief and of the Lord or not, he still was willing to help Solomon in this project, and he was eager to help Solomon as well. So Hiram continues. He says, "Now I have sent a skillful man, endowed with understanding, Huram, my master craftsman." So this individual is also called, in some translation, Huram Abi, was the son of a woman of the daughters of Dan, and his father was a man of Tyre. So this individual, whose mother was an Israelite, was more than suited for a job. He was very skilled in working with gold and silver and bronze and iron, stone and wood, purple and blue, fine linen, crimson, and making all the engraving and accomplish any plan which may be given to him. So he was extremely qualified to work with the workers, whether the workers were provided by Solomon or even Hiram's own workers, but to accomplish all of this great artwork that's going into the temple. And Hiram also agreed to send the timber, and Hiram said he would cut wood from Lebanon as much as you need. We will bring it to you in rafts by sea to Joppa, and you will carry it up to Jerusalem. So he acknowledged then the compensation that Solomon offered was certainly sufficient and satisfactory. I'm going to flip over here to a diagram. I don't know if you can see this. The letters are awfully small to read, but it is a cutaway of the temple itself. And just a few, and we'll look at the different parts here in just a second, but just some interesting facts about the temple that they're building. This is Israel's first temple. Israel had the tabernacle for 400 years. Remember, the tabernacle was the more portable house of worship that the Israelites had had over 400 years as they wandered through the wilderness, as they came into the promised land up to this point. Right now, I kind of ask in my mind, well, where is the tabernacle now? They're building this big temple, and from what I saw, the last mention of the tabernacle before it comes, they mention bringing all the things to the temple to install them. Right now, the tabernacle is on a high place in Gibeon, is the place where they are worshiping in the tabernacle. But David wanted to build the temple, and he was forbidden from doing so because he was a man of war. David gave Solomon the architectural design for the temple, and on the design, I don't have a good picture. It was even more difficult to see. But as you look at the design of the temple, it is twice the size in almost every dimension of the tabernacle that they're worshiping now in the temporary, more fabrics and ability to move the tabernacle. But the temple itself is going to be twice as big as what they have now in the tabernacle. David accumulated treasures and building materials for the building of the temple, and the cost in today's money was expected or estimated to be $3 to $6 billion. That's a B with a billion. And all these lavish gold and precious metals that they were building with. Solomon began construction 490 years after Israel came out of Egypt. So there's that point in time to indicate when this was going on. The temple site was located on Mount Moriah, where Abraham had offered Isaac. The temple was built of great stones, cedar beams, and boards overlaid with gold. And the construction took 7 years, took a little over 7 years to fully construct. During the dedication, once they finished it, there was a big dedication ceremony, and Solomon offered 220,000 oxen, 120,000 sheep, and a 14-day feast, all part of this dedication. The temple was built by 30,000 Israelites, 150,000 Canaanites, Phoenician artists, and craftsmen from Tyre. The temple faced east and west. It was built in the general plan of the tabernacle, but twice the size. It was 90 feet long, 30 feet. The tabernacle was 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, 45 feet high. So the temple would believe almost double that. The holy place was of the temple itself was 60 feet by 30 feet. The most holy place, or the Holy of Holies, was 30 feet by 30 feet. And the most holy place was separated from the holy place by a veil, the scriptures say. In some places, there's a little dispute whether that separation was a veil only, or if there was also some kind of hard surface doors of some sort that were overlaid with gold that also may have been separating the two areas. In the holy place, we see furniture of the golden altar of incense, golden candlesticks on the north side. There were 5 of those, and 5 golden candlesticks on the south side, as well as we see in 2 Chronicles chapter 4, there were 5 tables of showbread on the north and 5 tables on the south. The furniture, only the furniture in the most holy place was just the Ark of the Covenant that they will eventually bring as part of the dedication. Then there's a bronze altar, was 30 feet square and 15 feet high, and a brazen laver called a sea. It was 15 feet in diameter and 8 feet deep, and sat on 12 bronze oxen. And as you look at the diagram, I thought I was going to have a laser pointer. Sorry about that. But in this outer courtyard, you have the altar where they had burned the incense, this big square structure you can see on the right side. And that's where they offered the sacrifices and the burnt offerings. Down here on the left is depicted again, this is just somebody's depiction of what's called the sea. It was a metal bowl or basin. It was 7.5 feet high and 15 feet in diameter. It held 12,000 gallons of water for the priest to wash in. And it was supported underneath by 12 oxen, 3 facing in each direction. As you come around the bottom there, you see some more, they're actually wheeled stands, and each of these wheeled stands held a large basin containing water for the rinsing of the animal parts that were being used for burnt offerings and general cleanup. And then as you look inside, that first big area would have been called it's called different things in different translations. Nave is one translation, but that's basically the holy place, which is the larger room in the front there. And it was 60 feet by 30 feet, and it contained that golden altar of incense, the golden tables for the bread of the presence or the showbread, and 10 golden lampstands on 5 on the north and south walls. So you can't get, somebody tried to depict just how elaborate the artwork was, and the working of the gold, and how everything was covered in gold, and the depiction of the palm trees and pomegranates, and all of these depictions in the walls were just something else to behold. Then as they had built the Holy of Holies, which is a smaller room, you see the stairs going up to it. The cherubim were depicted. They had wings. This is just somebody's depiction, but there were 2 of them. The wings spanned across the entire room, the tip of one touching one wall, the tip of the other touching the other wall, and then they connected the other set of wings in the center of the room, under which the Ark of the Covenant rested. So it must have really been a big sight to behold. Besides the temple, you can see in the cutaway, kind of on the left side of the building, around the perimeter, I believe it was just 3 sides, but around the perimeter were built a structure that had 3 different levels, and those chambers were used for storage and for different things that they needed for sacrifices, but it was a lot of it was storage area for all those supplies that they were going to need to operate the temple. And that went all around the other side of the temple as well that you can't see. There were 2 wooden ornate doors that were overlaid with gold that separated the Holy of Holies and the most holy place and the holy place. At least that's what is said in 1 Kings chapter 6. And then for light, at the very top, kind of the cutaway, there were some windows then in the holy place to provide some light from the outside, but there were no windows in the Holy of Holies there. As people entered the building, you can see on the right side of the building, there's a little vestibule area. There were two large columns that were made of bronze. There were two big pillars. The one on the north they named Boaz, and the one on the south they called Yakin. So I'm not exactly sure why. I didn't exactly understand why the pillars of these columns had names, but they did name those pillars. They had some purpose. Depending on what you read, some of it was structural in nature. Some of it sounded like, because they were hollow, it might actually have been ability to gather rainwater for the cistern that they had built underneath. But at any rate, that was an important piece that they were told about the temple itself. Those are mostly the structures of the temple in a visual form. Let me read a little bit here a little more about the temple from a Bible dictionary. And I apologize for some of the redundancy here, but there are a couple of things that came out in this additional writing. So, before his death, David had with all his might provided materials in great abundance for the building of the temple on the summit of Mount Moriah, on the east of the city, on the spot where Abraham had offered up Isaac. In the beginning of his reign, Solomon set about giving effect to the desire that had been so earnestly cherished by his father, and prepared additional materials for the building. From subterranean quarries at Jerusalem, he obtained these huge rocks of stone for the foundations and walls of the temple. These stones were prepared for their places in the building under the eye of Tyrian master builders, those skilled builders from Tyre we read about Hiram supplying. He also entered into a compact with Hiram for supplying whatever else he needed. As the hill on which the temple was to be built did not afford sufficient level space, they had to do some work there as far as leveling it. So a huge wall of solid masonry of a great height, in some places more than 200 feet high, was raised across the south of the hill, and a similar wall on the eastern side. And in the spaces between were erected many arches and pillars, thus raising up that general surface to the required level. Solomon also provided for sufficient water supply for the temple by hewing in the rocky hill vast cisterns into which water was conveyed by channels from the pools near Bethlehem. One of these cisterns, it was called the Great Sea, was capable of containing 3 million gallons. The overflow was led off by a conduit to the Kidron Valley. So in all of these preparatory undertakings of building the building site up, preparing this building site, building those retaining walls, preparing those cisterns underneath, all that took about 3 years. And then once that was done, then they could proceed with the actual erection of the great building and building it up. One thing I found fascinating is all the preparation required to make all these pieces fit together, because we're told that no sound of a hammer or axe or any tool of iron was heard as the structure arose. And one quote was, "Like some tall palm, the noiseless fabric sprang." So the building was 60 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. And the engineers of one of these exploration, Palestinian Exploration Fund, as they explored some of these sites and some of these digs, they have actually discovered what they think was the cornerstone for the temple, of the original temple. But it's fascinating. They say it's probably the most fascinating stone in the world, just because of the history and what it was the cornerstone for. And its actual cornerstone is 3 feet by 8 inches high, 14 feet long, and it rests on a solid rock at a depth of 79 feet 3 inches below the present surface. So 79 feet below where the surface is, they found this what they think was the chief cornerstone. And of course, as you remember, in this area, as people are conquered, things are destroyed, people rebuild, they just keep rebuilding one level on another. So what they found, though, at the original level, 79 feet under the current level, what they think is this cornerstone. Around the temple is courtyards. The courtyard, there's actually another wall here that's not really well depicted, but there's within that wall there were other chambers, and there were chambers on the southern, western, and northern sides, and that was what I was talking about. Some of that's actually connected to the building, but there's also these courtyards that are around it. The one courtyard that's closest in is called the Court of the Priests, or called the Inner Court, and that inner court is what we see here as containing the altar and the brazen sea, they call it, with a big container of big basin. But as you came out from there, there's also courtyards ultimately for the general, I guess, population, for the Israelites, in which they came to worship. This was more of an interior area for the priests, but then as they built it, and as the temple was added onto later, when Herod rebuilt it, and there were additional courtyards, additional divisions. For instance, there's a courtyard for women, courtyard for Gentiles, and then varying areas of use within those courtyards, whether it was, I believe it's the courtyard of women, where some people refer to where the money changers were. And we read about how the money changers, Jesus drove out of the temple because of what they were doing. But as the temple was destroyed and rebuilt in the future, they're just different. It was just magnificent, this original structure. But we find out later that this particular structure that Solomon erected was many times, it was pillaged during the course of its history. It was last pillaged and destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. And he burned the temple. He carried all the treasures away from the temple with him to Babylon. And these sacred vessels were ultimately, at the close of their captivity, restored by the Jews and restored to the Jews by Cyrus. So it was initially plundered, taken away, and then King Cyrus returned those as they came back to rebuild the temple. But it was never as grand as what Solomon had built at this point. As we look at all the efforts here that Solomon made to praise the Lord, to glorify the Lord, and his being thankful for what the Lord did. There's two or three things here. Solomon did not hesitate to describe the Lord as greater than all gods in verse 5. We see again that Hiram may have already accepted God as the greatest of all gods, but regardless, Solomon was not ashamed to praise the name of the God. And as we interact with individuals today, in the community, in our work, with other people, I hope we are not ashamed to proclaim the Lord and proclaim our God to other people. In Romans chapter 1, verse 16, Paul says, "I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first, and also for the Greek." So that's one thing we can learn from this. We must be able to proclaim the Lord to others and not be ashamed to proclaim the Lord to others. Something else here we see in this lesson, the hand of God is at work throughout this entire temple building process. So even though David was not allowed to build the temple, he collected the supplies and the workers so ultimately the temple could be built. And also his relationship with Hiram made it possible for Solomon to complete this. So God can and does use individuals we see in certain lessons throughout the Bible from various backgrounds to accomplish his will. We also are reminded of all the talents that these workers had. And we've got to use our talents to glorify God and to do what he desires. In this case, Hiram, the skilled craftsman, he really serves an example. He was ready and he was willing to help the workers erect this to glorify God. So we also need to be aware of what talents we have in order to accomplish what the Lord expects of us as well. Anybody have comments? We're just about out of time. I'm sorry that was steamrolled a little bit, but I just found it fascinating about the temple construction and what all went into it and just how glorious it really was. Anybody have any comments as we finish up? Okay, next week we will, I believe the lesson is, now that the temple is completed, the Israelites then, Solomon will return the Ark of the Covenant to its resting place in the Holy of Holies that we mentioned about under the cherubim there, and also the dedication, the big celebration for having completed this temple as well. So thank you, everybody, for your attention today. Appreciate your being here.